Kia ora, welcome.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you very much for making time. And as Michelle says, it's Youth Volunteering Week, so we'll be explaining a little bit more about some volunteering insights. Just a brief disclaimer for those of you who joined the previous State of the Decade report. The first sort of few minutes will be a recap of some similar information I gave at that webinar. So for those of you who missed out, we'll give a brief overview of that report. And the second half will be on some additional insights into youth volunteering. So the State of the Decade report was a response to 10 years of Volunteering New Zealand publishing these State of Volunteering reports. Because we've seen over the past decade that volunteering has changed in various forms. We've seen, for example, the changing demographics of New Zealand, changing cultural norms, changing habits, economic conditions, and so on. But despite this, we also see that the voluntary sector remains strong and resilient throughout. And so we know that actually the sector as a whole is in a very positive shape. And people we speak to in general are very happy and very positive about the overall health of the sector. We also see that it's volunteers themselves and the organizations that are really the backbone that supports the success of this sector. So it's not just an accident that it's a successful sector. It's not an accident that all these things are positive. It's underpinned by a strong backbone of volunteers and organizations like yourselves who are joining us here today. At the same time, you also found lots of important challenges, one of them being around aging volunteers and the recruitment of youth volunteers in particular, which is one thing we'll be addressing further today. And so, also looking at the previous 10 years gives us a good understanding of future opportunities to improve and what we can do to further strengthen the sector. The kind of headline figure that is worth noting, which comes from the General Social Survey published by Stats New Zealand, is that 53.0% of people volunteered over the previous 4 weeks. And of those 53% of people who volunteered, the majority did so directly for another person, or what's previously been called informal volunteering. And so that's about 40.8% of people volunteering informally, 27.6% through an organization. When we look at that 53% of people who volunteer, this is actually an increase of 2.3 percentage points from the previous period when it was reported, when it was 50.7% in 2021. And among those that volunteered, as I said, 27.6% are through an organization, 40.8% directly for another person. Those who have volunteered through an organization has actually decreased slightly. So what we've found is that more people are now volunteering informally or directly rather than through organizations. And this has a real impact on how a lot of us in this sector might experience volunteering on a day-to-day basis. We've also seen over the past 10 years that there's been a decade of transformation. So there's more people volunteering, but they're volunteering in different patterns. So we're continuing to see a rise in these flexible episodic volunteering, people doing a little bit here and there on more flexible terms rather than doing this on a regular basis. And this is a changing model to what's traditionally been called the civic core, the idea that the majority of volunteering is done by a very small but committed group of people. What we're seeing is that there's now a broader base of people who are contributing smaller but more regular amounts. And so this core group of volunteers has been shrinking. And what we're seeing is that instead of just a small handful doing the lion's share of the work, there are now many more people who are engaged in flexible and casual volunteering, a few hours here and there, but very large numbers of these casual volunteers. So the civic core model, just for those who might not be familiar, is a highly influential model that says the majority of work, something like, say, 80% of volunteering is done by 20% of the volunteering workforce. But as I mentioned, when we look at the population level data from Stats New Zealand and our own research from BNZ, we find that this civic core model is changing. And this is important because it shows that in some ways volunteering is expanding if we look at the number of those who are volunteering. It's just that the hours that they're volunteering is changing in the shape and the schedule that they're engaging in. When we look at the number of hours contributed over the previous 4 weeks, we can see this chart here. So in technical terms, the distribution of volunteering hours is roughly bimodal. So what that means is we have a large number of people on the one hand who volunteer only a few hours, and on the other side of the tail, a large group of people who volunteer 25 plus hours a month. So people are either doing a little bit here and there, or they're doing a lot. And this is that kind of bimodal sort of two peaks, if you want to think about it in this way. The average volunteering hours has increased. So we've got 18.1 hours per 4 weeks, which is over an hour per week of increase compared to 2016. And the most common contribution remains under 5 hours of volunteering in a 4 week period. 32.5% of people volunteered for less than 5 hours over the previous 4 weeks, and this is the most common amount of volunteering hours done. When we look at the gender breakup of volunteering, 55.9% of women volunteer compared to 50% of men. And this has been relatively consistent where women in general volunteer more than men, and this has been a relatively stable pattern throughout. When we look at the life stage, and we're going to come back to this, we can see that youth volunteers, so this is on the left-hand panel, those who are aged 15 to 24, have the lowest rates of people who volunteered compared to other age groups. We're going to come back to that and look at some reasons why that might be so. Another thing we look at is the sector seeing a ongoing complaint about aging volunteers and the challenges these pose. So over the past decade, we've seen that organizations who see aging volunteers as among their biggest challenges is growing from 25% in 2018 to just under 50% in 2024, which was the most recent state of volunteering report. That was not the state of the decade report. So we see a growing trend of concern around aging volunteers. And the reason it matters is for a number of different ways. Firstly, it's the simple problem of representation. So aging volunteers mean that there's less representation from volunteers across other age groups, young people, for example. There's also an issue around succession planning. So aging volunteers mean that there is no future pipeline of volunteers for the organization. And so it runs the risk that there are issues with who will replace the current leaders and volunteers. One of the things that the State of the Decade report highlighted was that compliance burdens and regulation take up a lot of time for those involved in managing volunteers in organizations. So there's a lot of compliance burdens with paperwork, um, regulations having to be complied with by managers and so on. But on the other hand, there was an acknowledgement that this is important from the perspective of safety, especially looking after volunteers. We've also seen over the decade an increasing professionalization of the sector. So we're now seeing that volunteering is an activity that requires training and professional standards. It's no longer this idea of unpaid amateurs, which used to be more rife in the earlier parts of the past decade. So this idea is being challenged with increased professionalization. And Volunteering New Zealand has its own guidelines on this called the Best Practice Guidelines, which you can find on the website, that actually explain some of the best practice guidelines for how to effectively run an inclusive, effective, and efficient volunteering organization. Before we turn to the data around youth volunteering, it's worth just looking at what we call the state of the decade, state of volunteering measure. So this is a very rough metric for how we ask people to rank the state of volunteering. So we ask them roughly how healthy they think the volunteering sector is. And this has stayed relatively constant with a 10-year average of 6.5 out of 10. So these are not exceptionally high grades or high results, but they show a generally stable perspective of how volunteering is holding in New Zealand. Let's now look a little bit further at the data around youth volunteering. So when I refer to youth volunteers, I'm going to refer to people who are age 15 to 24. And amongst this age group, 45.8% volunteered in the previous 4 weeks. Now, this compares to the overall average, as we saw in the first slide, of 53.0%. So there are far fewer youth who are volunteering. But what's interesting to note is that amongst those who volunteered through an organization, the average hours that youth volunteers contributed over the previous 4 weeks is 18.4 hours. Now, the average across the population is 15.5. So that's nearly 3 hours a month more than the population average. And so what we're seeing is that even though on paper it might look like youth are less engaged, when we drill down into the details, we find that actually youth are volunteering much more. And these are figures from Stats New Zealand's latest general social survey. So these are population level data that we can be fairly confident in across the country. Youth volunteers, on the other hand, are disproportionately represented in those who volunteer, but who do so for 5 hours or less a month. Again, being part of this flexible, casual pool of volunteers. So 37.9% of youth volunteers contributed 5 hours or less per month, whereas the national average for people who volunteer in this category is 32.5. So in other words, there are more young people who are engaged in this casual, episodic model of volunteering. But there are still 17.6% of youth volunteers who contributed over 25 hours per month. So this is still a significant portion of youth volunteers who are contributing long hours on par with some of the most committed volunteers in the sector. When we look at the sectors that youth are most likely to volunteer in, we can find the following top three sectors. So the top sector is sports and recreation. So 36.9% of youth volunteers volunteer in the area of sports and recreation. And that's much higher than the population average of 32.3% volunteering in this space. And so sports and recreation is not only the most popular area for youth volunteers to be engaged in, it's also at a higher level than the general population. Perhaps surprisingly, it's the same case in spiritual or religious related volunteering, where 29.0% of youth are involved in this sector compared to the national average of 26.3. Social services also have higher levels of youth volunteers than the national average. So it's 13.7% of youth volunteers volunteer in this sector compared to 11.6% across the overall figures. So these three sectors, sports and recreation, religious and spiritual, and social services, are the three most common places where youth are likely to volunteer. But let's also look at where they're least likely to volunteer. So, in environment and conservation, only 8.1% of youth volunteers work in this space, and that's compared to the general population average of 11.3%. So, this is one area where young people volunteer less than the average in the population. Community development, such as housing or marae, are also on the low end of this area. So 9.4% of youth volunteer in this area, 13.5% of the general population volunteers in this realm. Health is also the third least likely area for youth people to volunteer in, with 9.4%, but this is in some ways comparable to the general figure of 9.5%. So again, when we look at what are the areas where young people and youth volunteers are least likely to volunteer in? It's environmental and conservation issues, community development and Marai-based volunteering, and health. We can also look at the figures to understand from the population level data the kinds of different barriers youth face compared to other groups. So when we look at barriers to formal volunteering, so these, by the way, this is a survey of Stats New Zealand who looked at people who did not volunteer and looked at the reasons they gave for why they did not volunteer. And so this is quite important data for us. So amongst the people who did not volunteer, 24.7% of youth volunteers stated that no one had asked them. This is compared to 16.3% of the overall figure who say that nobody's asked them to volunteer, which is why they don't volunteer. 14.5% of youth volunteers do not know how to get involved, again, compared to the national average of 8.1%. So youth volunteers are again overrepresented in this area of saying that they don't know how to get involved. And 15.4% had no interest in volunteering, which is compared to 8.2% of the general population. But when we look at the general population and compare them to youth volunteers were less likely to face barriers to volunteering on the grounds of ill health or on the grounds that they prefer to give money instead of time. And this aligns broadly with other evidence we have. So young people tend to be healthier than older people and more mobile. And they tend to be less wealthy and have less disposable income. And so the idea of giving money instead of time is likely to be less of an incentive or a reason not to volunteer. We know that there is a significantly higher rate of turnover among young volunteers. So we know in an organization that young people leave and join organizations at a higher and more frequent rate than older volunteers. And part of this is because youth volunteers place much higher emphasis on their values aligning with the organization they volunteer with. And so, for example, when we look at youth focus group results, we find that youth volunteers are much more interested in making sure that their values align with the organization instead of volunteering for an organization that has brand recognition, like a really old or a prestigious organization. Youth volunteers' primary motivations do align with the general populations, so it's primarily about helping others and making friends. These are consistently the two most common reasons people volunteer, and there's no difference in youth volunteers' motivation aligning with these two. But we do find that there are more youth volunteers who are motivated in addition by gaining experience to put on their CV compared to those who are aged 55 and above. On the more negative side, we find that youth volunteers are less likely to report that they feel valued and respected. And youth volunteers are also less likely to report a rating of 7 out of 10 or above when we give them the scale of the state of volunteering. Word of mouth is also the most common way youth volunteers find out about volunteering, with the exception of volunteering during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the primary method for youth engaging in volunteering activities was through social media. But in general, word of mouth, whether directly with friends or others, is still the most common way of engaging youth volunteers. And what we find is that in our focus groups, only one or two people are ever familiar with the idea of a volunteer center. And in some focus groups, we find that youth had no idea what these were. And so it shows a real change in where youth are getting information about volunteering. Some provisional data also shows that there's different levels of youth volunteering across the regions, but this is very provisional. So we find, for example, that youth volunteers in large urban areas, there's a much higher level of youth volunteering in large urban areas like Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch compared to more rural areas. And this aligns again with some of the early evidence we have, but it's an area where VNZ plans to do more work to explore why this is the case and how generalizable it is. So I'll end there and open the floor for any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Johann. I've been making some notes, even though I've kind of seen these slides before. But we warmly welcome questions to Johann. So